name that strikes terror into the heart of anyone who has anything to do with CED. So get in your seats, folks. And if I really want to terrify you, I'll mention the global economy, which has been buffeted over the last 10 years and also of late in all of the relationships among developed and developing nations around the world. We want to talk to you about the economic outlook, and there's no one better to have to speak to you than Bart van Ark, who is the Executive Vice President, Chief Economist, and Chief Strategy Officer of our sister organization, the Conference Board, who works with a team of economists all around the world, London, Brussels, Beijing, New York, Brussels, and Beijing. And with Bart today to help to amplify his comments, we have on my far left Roger Ferguson, who is the president and CEO of TIAA, and also spent several relaxing years as the vice chair of the Federal Reserve, including, I'm sure, a few relaxing days during that tour of duty. And equally relaxed and rested, we have Susan Schwab, a former U.S. trade representative. So they're very eager to take on a real challenge, so they're going to be here to comment on the global economy and to amplify on Bart's remarks. So Bart, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Joe, and indeed I'm very honored to do this outlook this time with two of those very distinguished speakers and board members of ours. So I'll try to keep my comments short, briefly basically set the stage for the discussion so we can maximize our time with Susan and Roger, but also with you. So prep your questions. As you know, everybody can talk about the economy, so free to chime in during this discussion. Let me sort of briefly set the stage of the global economy, and let's start with the good news, and that is that overall we believe at the Conference Board that the economy remains in pretty good shape. Despite some of the headlines that we're seeing that make us worry about the sustainability, there's obviously a lot going on, but we're coming out of a very strong 2017. The numbers for 2017 are still going up as the latest estimates coming in. The tail end of the year was quite strong, so we're ending up with a global economy of 3.2% growth, and in 2018 the current projections are still pointing more in the direction of 3.3% growth. Now, clearly, we started the year with a lot of financial turmoil, and I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit how to interpret that. Our take on it at the Conference Board is that, on balance, that financial turmoil is largely the result of a stronger economy and sentiment that perhaps the equity markets were running a little bit ahead of that, but that basically we're in an environment where inflationary pressures, potential wage increases, interest rate increases are going to play a role. So sometimes I call this, maybe we're just going back to the old normal. Some of you may remember that before 2008, where we were living in times that interest rates were sometimes going up and inflation was rising and those kind of things. We're not there yet, but clearly we could be moving back to that kind of environment. In the short term, there are really no big clouds on the horizon. This morning we released our Consumer Confidence Index for the United States. It's dropped off a little bit, but that's for the first time since many, many months, and 1 month really doesn't make a trend. And what is very important is that consumer confidence in the United States is still at the highest level of almost 2 decades now, and that's very important for the way that consumers think about the state of the current economy, the present conditions in the labor market, and the way that they're thinking about the economy will move forward and go and develop. All our short-term indicators are pointing in the right direction. But taking a medium-term perspective, then the dynamics that we're facing become a little bit more challenging. And that's really what the last 3 bullet points here are about. Our biggest concern, and also, as we will see in a minute, the biggest concern of our members, we survey our CEOs every year, is really that we're facing an increasing amount of labor market challenges and particular talent shortages that are beginning to impact our businesses. And that will impact not just our ability to attract the best people, but also our ability to drive digitization, to drive innovation in our businesses going forward. And that is really going to be a big challenge going forward. Now, you notice that I conveniently skipped over the third point, which is the issue of trade tensions that are rising. And the reason why I'm doing that is partly because of time. but partly because I have some people on the panel, particularly Susan, who knows so much more about it, that we'll save that part of the discussion. We'll definitely talk about it, save that part of discussion to a little later. So a lot of challenges and opportunities, but really in the short term, as I said, things look pretty good. The blue bars here is the projections that we're looking at for global GDP growth for 2018. So we're looking at about a 3.3% growth rate. The United States is the top line, is at 3% growth. We're a little bit at the higher end of the consensus there, but we frankly believe that, you know, the pickup in investment that we've been seeing already in 2017, the tax plan that may not do a lot, but it certainly will not do a lot of harm, we believe, is all going to help to push investment further and particularly to drive productivity growth. We also released our latest estimates of productivity yesterday, and again, we're beginning to see some of an uptick, and we think it's about time to rethink the story of the productivity slowdown and begin to think where the upside for that productivity growth is going to be. Europe is slightly lower than last year. As you can see, the orange dots, the orange dashes are really what the 2017 estimate. But Europe is growing well above its trend, so we're really not in the short term too much worried about that. The UK is perhaps a little bit more of a worry. It's further down in the business cycle. It is facing major challenges from the whole Brexit debate, so that concerns a little bit going forward. And moving then to the emerging markets, which are all sort of at the bottom of the chart there. You know, what we see there is their solid performance, but we should perhaps remember that emerging markets are still growing significantly slower than they used sort of in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And some of that is good news. A lot of these emerging markets, notably China, are simply becoming richer. When you become richer, you grow a little bit more slowly. But we have to accept the fact that emerging markets are not in the double digits as we had seen a little earlier. Perhaps we can talk a little bit more about that. When we go to the medium term, we move from opportunities to challenges, as I already mentioned. And the biggest challenge that we're seeing here, you see these growth rates in the next 5-year periods to come down a little bit. And into the 2020s, we see global growth dropping off again to below 3%. And a lot of that has to do with that slowdown that we're seeing in the labor force, and that has to do with the aging of our populations in mature economies. It's also happening in China. And even in other emerging economies, population growth and labor force growth is not going to be as fast as it was in previous decades. Now, you can make up for that by growing the productivity of the people who are still in the workforce. But the question really is, how positive can we be that that will be enough of a productivity growth to offset those labor force challenges that we're seeing? And our view is that it's going to be quite a tall order, because these projections already include a pickup in productivity growth to make up for these growing shortages as we go forward. So where we think we are currently is that we're short-term doing well, and that in the medium term, we're actually going to slow down. So that's sort of the top right corner of this matrix here, right? Supply side constraints that we're going to face down the road. Robert Shiller, who's a Nobel laureate, had a great piece in the New York Times this weekend, where he basically said, well, you know, economists are very good in predicting the next 6 months, which is what I talked about in the first few minutes. They're also pretty good in talking about the long term, the next 5 and the next 10 years. But they're really not so good in talking about what's going to happen in the next year or the year thereafter, which is sort of, you know, that time period where as businesses, we really have to think very hard what we're going to do in that time frame. And that is indeed one of the toughest places to go. Where is this going to be in a year or 2 years, rather than in the next 6 months or in the next 5 or 10 years? So some people are not on the right top side, but on the left top side. Larry Summers, for example, is arguing that, you know, actually we shouldn't be overexcited about the current uptick, and that frankly this idea of secular stagnation that is driven by this environment of low interest rates that we've had for such a long time, that is likely going to continue. So short-term weakness will even lead to long-term weakness. Others, for example, the OECD, are saying, well, you know, maybe we're short-term weak, but maybe we need some of that. Because one of the problems that we're facing is that there are so many businesses out there that really are not sufficiently strong to face the future. In other words, there are some very successful firms, but there are a lot of firms that haven't been able to be successful in digitization and in productivity growth and all this. And maybe what we need at some time is that we need to find a way to get rid of those firms, whether that's going through a recession or another type of crisis. And after that, you're going to create more room for faster growth with the firms that are actually able to survive this crisis. So you can go from short-term weakness into medium-term strength. And then you can go to the right bottom side and say, well, maybe we're short-term strong, but what if that short-term strength lasts long enough? If we have another 3 or 4 quarters of strong growth, maybe it will actually help us to make these investments, to actually spend time on training our people, something that we discussed in the previous session, in order to deal with the medium-term challenges that we have ahead of us. So there are lots of different scenarios that we can think about, and I'd certainly like to hear from Roger and Susan where they find themselves on this spectrum. Now, to wrap up, our CEOs also have a very clear view about this. Every year we ask our CEOs a bunch of questions around strategy, but one question is sort of, what keeps you awake at night? What are the things that are sort of more important for you now than they normally are? And what we see there is that very consistently around the world and different functions, CEOs are looking at things like the failure to attract and retain top talent, the challenges of the digitization and disruptive environment in order to create new business models, the facing of new competitors around the global economy, whether this is within the United States or abroad, developing a next generation of new leaders, and cybersecurity. So the issues that CEOs are concerned about is really how do we leverage this short-term strength and avoid it to turn into that medium-term weakness? How are we going to deal with those supply constraints that I was talking about a little earlier? So those are some of the challenges that CEOs are talking about, and it's very much fit for the agenda that we were looking at. So when you saw the opening slide here, you saw there a question about, you know, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? And economists always like to use their both hands and not give you an answer here. And frankly, it is in the eye of the beholder what you think is the case. But one thing that we would argue is it's not just about whether the glass is half full or empty, it's about what you fill the glass with. And the question is whether we will be able and whether we will be successful as businesses to fill that glass with improvement in talent, dealing with our labor shortages, driving productivity for innovation and digitization. And that could indeed get us out of that scenario of short-term strength to medium-term strength, or out of that scenario of short-term strength to medium-term weakness to one that is about medium-term strength. So let me stop there and let me go right away and ask, and maybe Susan, we can start with you, and ask you sort of, you know, where do you find yourself in this glass half full, glass half empty story? Should we think positively about the economy, or are you as concerned as some others are about the medium-term weaknesses that we're describing here?
Well, I would say it's hard to feel distressed when virtually every country in the world is growing again, finally. You know, you look back and look at where we were in 2008, you know, where we were 10 years ago, and you see everyone's growing, with a couple of exceptions, and the exceptions sort of deserve, you know, you look at Venezuela and a couple others like that, and they kind of deserve to be where they are. And so it's hard to get distressed on that score. I know we're going to be talking about trade policy later, but even unless you are looking at a monumentally stupid set of trade policies, which is not beyond the realm of possibility, but unless you're looking at a monumentally stupid set of trade policies, even if you project out from what we're currently looking at, in the aggregate, you're not talking about a whole lot of dislocation off of your scenarios. It looks pretty good. I mean, the scenario looks pretty good. It's not, you know, it's not so outrageous as to be bubble, 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 but it looks pretty solid to me.
Roger, more optimistic, more pessimistic, about right?
I'd say about right, and I know panels are already interesting if there's more, you know, disagreement than agreement. So this panel may be sort of boring, but I think I'm pretty much where Susan is. So short term, for sure. After quite a while, we have synchronous global growth, which is not something that you need a doctor for. It's a positive thing. So synchronous global growth seems to be the story for 2017, 2018, and I think probably going forward. Intermediate term, a number of the forces are working in the right direction. So we're starting to see gradually, at last, a pickup in corporate investment, for example. consumer confidence is high. Though it's an unusual experiment in the US, we have fiscal stimulus that may lead to inflation, but let's say at this stage, it's certainly going to have an incrementally positive result on growth. I think where we start to get into a question mark is the intermediate to longer term. And here, demographic forces come into play. The fact that at least we in the US have to sort out our entitlements and the drag that that may cause, the need to raise taxes, et cetera. So on the short to intermediate term, or short to medium term, count me sort of in the lower right-hand box. The question for me is productivity picking up and dealing with the demographic challenges that we're confronting. And I put that as more medium to longer term, if we can sort of parse things across three timeframes, not just two.
So let's stay with the short term for a minute. Let's see if we can bring a little bit more disagreement to this panel. This financial market turmoil, is it a good thing, healthy, that we see this adjustment, or is there something to worry about?
Well, look, I spend much of my time thinking about markets as I'm responsible for overseeing investments of literally, more or less $1 trillion now. So my view on this is the earlier element of volatility, I would buy your concept of, back to the old normal. That was volatility driven by a recognition that we are having synchronous growth. Perhaps the US has reached full employment. It may well be that the Fed's going to have to move rates up as they predict, or maybe even a little faster. And so I think the market sort of came to a recognition that a monetarily driven growth rate was probably less in the cards going forward than it had been in the past. This most recent volatility, it goes back to some points that Susan or you were sort of implying, I think came from a shock imposed by an anxiety around a possibility of a trade war. So that's a series of iffy words, And the reason I say anxiety about the possibility of a trade war is it looks as though what's happened is the president has decided to use very tough language to engage in some bilateral negotiations. And I don't know where those are going to come out yet. And so what you saw in the market last week was, the possibility of tariffs. Then what you saw in the market over the last day or two is, up 2%, up 3%, because maybe all we're doing is just starting.
But it can be different again tomorrow.
And it could be different again tomorrow. Yeah. So that kind of volatility is not based on fundamentals. In that sense, it's not positive. And I think it is a response to a lot of headline risk, underlying or ignoring, if you will, what I think is fundamentally a pretty positive trend. So like all economists, the answer is yes to both.
Yes, to both.
Both bad and good.
Well, I was wondering how many minutes it would take that we have to talk about trade, and we're probably already there. So, Susan, you're just back from China, and you got it back, safely. So it all looks great. So, what's your take?
On which particular trade issue?
Well, you're just back from China. The trade debate has obviously in the last couple of days moved towards the China issue very specifically. A lot of analysts are actually suggesting that some of the issues around steel and aluminium was more a negotiation tactic than something that will really begin to play out, although it has been implemented in some cases, but quite a few exemptions. But it seems that the tendency of the administration is to say this is really about China. Is it really about China? And what is the response?
So let me begin with what should be obvious, but just to make sure we've got this on the record. I am representing myself. I'm not representing any institution that I'm affiliated with. I'm certainly not representing the administration, right?
Noted.
Okay.
Noted.
In my career, I have never encountered trade policy as noisy as this one or as volatile as this one. So I'm not sure I was on the plane yesterday coming back from China, and I'm not sure what happened during that period of time. So I may be 24 hours, I was going to say, I may be 24 hours out of date, which can be a very important period of time in the evolution of this administration's trade policy. So with that caveat, I'll comment. If the metric is the US trade deficit, which among us economists here is the wrong metric, we're never going to solve that metric with this trade policy. You're not going to lop $100 billion off of the bilateral deficit with China, or indeed any other country, unless and until we all figure out what we're going to do about the US savings rate, for example. So that's a macroeconomic set of issues, and I think everyone in this room probably recognizes it. And if you don't, go back to macroeconomics 101. However, there are real trade policy issues that this administration is trying to address, and that includes issues associated with China. Now, there is some element of schizophrenia associated with what the definition beyond the trade deficit is in terms of what is being addressed here. So you've got the steel and aluminum issue, and the Section 232 case, which is this national security case. And then you've got the Section 301 case, which is the intellectual property rights case, which is China-specific. The steel and aluminum case is the broader-based, everybody except now not necessarily everybody, because there are country exemptions and there'll be product exemptions. And there are substantive issues associated with all of these. So in the case of China, we have on the intellectual property side, we have the cyber theft issue. We have the forced technology transfer issues. So those are the issues addressed largely by the Section 301 case. Mm-hmm. And then you've got this raft of overcapacity issues, where the steel and aluminum cases have come up. But also you see coming down the pike, for those of you who study China, the Made in China 2025 that's been referenced. You know, if you like what you've seen in steel and aluminum, wait till you see what happens in semiconductors, or electric cars and so on. You've got that set of issues. Now, there are questions about how you get from point A to point B, and this president, this administration will be the first to tell you, and have told you many, many times, that those of us who have preceded this administration, we're the ones who negotiated all those bad agreements that got us to the place where we are today. So take everything I say with that grain of salt, but that's where they're trying to go. Now, my initial instinct is you don't start down this path by beating up your allies. I don't know how this will play out with the Chinese, and directly with the Chinese. Needless to say, I got an earful in Beijing last week. On the other hand, I read in the press that there's a dialogue going on, and you know, maybe this one will work where the ones that we conducted didn't.
Roger, is it getting us to a good place?
So first, let me totally defer to the person here who used to be the U.S. trade rep when it comes to these issues. So 2 or 3 points I'd add to this. One, actually, something that's not the norm in this discussion, but politics. This president ran on a certain platform, and my observation since he's been in office, though it may have been noisy and back and forth, is he seems to be trying to deliver on these promises. Right? And so one of his promises had to do with these sorts of manufacturing activities, call it steel, call it aluminum, coal, et cetera. So let's be eyes open. There's a political economy imperative here of a president who seems to be, you know, some may like it, some may not, trying to deliver on a set of promises. That's the way democracies work. Point 2, and here I defer to Susan completely, but this does seem to me the beginning of a series of bilateral negotiations after what may have been, you know, some executional missteps, we'll put it that way. So, you know, who's in, who's out, Canada looks like they're now sort of out of some of these concerns. Mexico perhaps out of some of these concerns. The Eurozone, not quite sure where they are. But it does seem that the negotiation energy seems to be going in more of a bilateral direction towards China. And, you know, Susan knows this far better than I do, but she did put her finger on a number of long-standing points of friction around micro industry specific questions, including technology transfer, IP, et cetera, that to a non-trade expert economist seem like reasonable things to talk about. The third point I'd make, very much back to Susan's point, this is at base a macro question, and part of the challenge in this discussion is, as you heard, because of the savings and investment imbalance in the U.S. and frankly the savings and investment imbalance in China, the way all these two very large global work players come together is in a combination of a current account deficit and a capital account surplus, i.e. the Chinese get lots of our dollars and they invest it back in U.S. Government securities. So this is not going to be resolved until both economies figure out these imbalances. Right. The Chinese are working at it, we're working at it. Who's going to be successful? Hard to say. So I'd add, those three components and leave total agreement with Susan on where the technical issues seem to lie.
So let me be here the naive textbook economist for a moment, right? And say, okay, first of all, I think we all learned that, bilateral isn't going to get us into the best place when it comes to a win-win situation in trade. Second, tariffs and even threats of tariffs is never a good way to get into a good place. And thirdly, trade negotiations, which typically happen behind closed doors because it is such a sensitive concept and it's a lot about trust, is best served by not, throwing it out into the open. So as a textbook economist, it seems we're completely off the real world that is evolving very differently. So how do we get back to, are the textbook economists completely wrong, or can we get back there with this sort of roundabout that we're currently making?
Well, odd for me to answer that since you're the trade person. So look, no, the textbook economists aren't completely wrong. I think we are grounded in a reality of an administration that seems not to trust the bilateral institutions or negotiations, in part because they look at, in part, I suspect, because they look at them and say, well, we don't like those results. And so that textbook answer of, bilateral is not really where you resolve these problems, which is, I'm sure, absolutely true. If you come in saying, gee, we don't like the results, and the way we got there was through WTO and these various rounds, so why not try something different? So I think there's a political economy dynamic here. This is not, I know some of the administration leaders better than others, a group that deals in general in abstractions. They are business people grounded in realities, and their expertise is negotiations. So I think they've chosen, I don't know if it's going to work or not, a path toward negotiation that seems to them very credible.
Susan, and then we'll open up for questions.
So when you've been a trade negotiator, you are used to the next group coming in and dumping all over what you did. The Obama administration came in and dumped all over the deals that I negotiated. So it kind of comes with the territory. This particular team has come in and they've kind of dumped all over everything that's happened since about 1934. 1947.
1947.
1947. They're very mistrustful of the institutions. It is also, though, worth noting that in the case, for example, of the WTO, the forward movement in terms of negotiations under the WTO essentially came to a screeching halt after 1994. The Doha round failed.
Exactly.
And I was a part of that failure. I was engaged in that negotiation for 3 years. And I think the WTO, the World Global Trading System, rules-based system, would have been well served if in 2003, 2004, which is when I think the Doha round failed, if we had said, it is not going to happen, let's move forward with the new set of issues. Let's talk about digital trade. Let's talk more about services and investment instead of getting hung up on the 20th century issues that we're hung up on. But that didn't happen. And it was only 2 years ago that most members of the WTO acknowledged that the Doha round had failed, and they still haven't moved forward. And so the rules-based system is having some issues. The jury is at, so you can understand the skepticism. What you don't know, what we don't know, is whether the new team, whether this administration is capable of closing any trade deals whatsoever, even on their terms. So they haven't actually closed anything yet. And some of the terms may be acceptable to trading partners and some may not. And if they are acceptable to trading partners, will they be acceptable to the Congress? And oh, by the way, their negotiating authority runs out summer of this year. It can be extended to 2021. And then after that, what we call trade promotion authority, which is this fast track authority through the Congress, disappears entirely. So there's a very interesting set of trajectories here. Lot of unknowns. I mean, I think a multilateral path is a much healthier path, but there are flaws in it. I think walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a big error because that was an opportunity to transcend the hang-up at the WTO. But we'll see whether the new team's capable of negotiating and closing.
Jury is still out.
Jury's out.
Yep. All right, let's take a few questions from the room. And to make maximum use of our time, we may take a few and then we'll answer them in a row. So raise your hand. As I say, anybody can talk about the global economy. You can certainly ask questions about the global economy. So, and there's more to the economy than just trade. Gentleman over there. Yes, please.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Rick Tagney, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Right.
Cool.
So I was in a meeting last week with a senator from Montana, and he was leading a group of U.S. delegations to China to talk about the U.S. improvement on the meat export from the U.S. to China, and the progress that we've made in regard to that trade. But he also expressed his concern on the recent trade war comments and how that would affect the agriculture business, especially with his state of Montana. And I was going to ask Ambassador Schwab, with your recent trip to China, how does that meeting in China give you, I guess, like, how does that meeting in China makes you think where we're heading, like in terms of hope for the overall trade war on agriculture? Because that was his main concern, the senator from Montana.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great comment. Any other questions right now? Let's take 2 or 3 so we can answer them a roll. Gentleman over here. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello? Yes.
Okay.
Bruce McClory, Brookings in the past. Maybe I'm alone, but I have a feeling of unease at the smooth projections that economists have to deal in, and that the world as we see it today around us is more filled with political risks and potential discontinuities. It's not a matter of short term and medium term or long term, but discontinuities that are impossible to project. But at a minimum, it would seem to me that as we look at the charts of who's doing what, there ought to be a list of red and yellow flashing lights around the world, whether it's tribalism at home or Russia or China or Middle East or whatever, that we ought to keep in mind. I don't know what I'd do about it, but I'd feel as though I was looking at the real world rather than one that is a smooth curve.
Thank you. Good question. One more right
here. Over here.
Oh, one over there. I'm sorry. I didn't see you. Please go ahead.
Tom McRae, President and CEO of Genworth. The question I have is, I started going to China, and many CEOs of Fortune 500 companies have been going for a long time, in the late 1980s. And I think there was a sense of Fortune 500 companies that the market was so big in China that we had to be there. But I do think that in the last 5 or so years, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are rethinking that. Ambassador, you're on the board of 4, including some who do a lot of business in China. And teachers and Genworth are both involved in these issues. And Ambassador, my sense was that there were pressure on prior administrations from the business community and big companies to not be too tough on China to allow us to go, but that is being rethought. And so the question is, do you think that the U.S. government and large or small employers that are in China may be changing their view, and that may change the tone of the debate and perhaps realize that a result where China might be willing to compromise more than certainly they've had in the last 10 or 15 years?
One more, otherwise we have to go back to the panel, otherwise we will forget. So if we have a second round, we'll take yours too, but let's take yours now.
Okay, thank you. Paula Stern, I've been a trustee for quite a while with CED. And I agree with you, Roger, that the president is certainly keeping his promises that he made with regard to trade. But I think that the way he is doing it, it reminds me very much of when his USTR, Bob Lighthizer, was deputy USTR back in the 80s in the Reagan administration, where we had these series of voluntary restraint agreements on steel. We had orderly marking agreements on autos. We had semiconductor agreements that were also part of this managed trade, country by country, sector by sector. And guess what we're talking about today? Steel and and autos and many of the same issues. So yes, he's kept his promise, but I do think I'd like to know whether you feel there is concern with regard to the overarching trade, economic, and geostrategic competition that the U.S. has with China during from the 1980s until now, and here we're still talking about and doing the 1980s dance again.
Right.
So I'd like you to talk
Sure.
to us about where you would like us to go, absent this particular approach.
Okay.
So Roger, that question is directly
Right.
to you,
So
so you want to start here?
This has devolved to a bilateral discussion around China. So let me try to give you at least what I think is going on. And no one should take this as either defense or attack on anything. This is trying to analyze what's going on. And I think what is going on here is the obvious thing that our mutual friend Graham Allison has written about, which is the rise of a brand new power threatening the U.S.'s predominance, and at the same time being totally intertwined, the two of us, through this trade and capital account dynamic, because it's both sides. And I think what we're looking at fundamentally is not dissimilar, if you think about economic history, from, and unfortunately these things end up in a bad place often, the rise of the U.S. as a major power threatening the old world of Europe. And within Europe, the rise of Germany threatening the UK. And even before that, France and Spain and the Netherlands. Economic history is just filled with this dynamic of robust new powers threatening the status quo or threatening the leading older powers. And it has now come down, I think, to the US and China. And the reason I think this has become so focused is because it has this big geopolitical component, in which economics is a part, along with the leadership, political leadership in the region. And what makes this one so fascinating, I think, from an analytical standpoint, is the point that was just made earlier, which is the supply chain intertwined nature of the US and the Chinese economy. And I think everyone is struggling with this, and it comes down to something that economists wouldn't suggest, but the real world of political economy suggests, is this not totally irrational focus on the bilateral relationship. We happen to have an administration now that I think, this is beyond political economy, the cheap psychology, so you'll forgive me, but seems to see the world in zero-sum, I win, you lose terms. And the obvious place to see that is between the US and China when it comes to these macro issues. Second point I'd make is it also has a very micro feel because there are some obvious losers. Everyone in this room believes that free trade is a very good thing overall, right, for obvious reasons. Yet, once you get outside of this room, there are clearly groups that think they're winners and groups that think they're losers. The winners have been, back to the young man's comment, the agricultural exporters that are finding China to be a really exciting, dynamic market, and one in which it's hard to imagine how we are going to lose. Those that are less certain, back to your comment, are the big industrialists and others who thought, oh my goodness, 1 billion plus people moving to the middle class, we're just going to market the heck out of our products and services and be really profitable. And like you, I think as I listen to CEOs, very, very few of them are in that mode anymore. They're much more skeptical. It's hard to make money. It's hard if you make money to get it out. There are these forced partnerships. There are all these challenges that I think are emerging among Fortune 100, Fortune 500 CEOs. I hear very few of them talking about, the selling millions or billions to billions, if you will. And so that's why I think we're where we are. And that's not, it's sort of economic, just a little political economy, but it's really politics. But I think ultimately what this is a power, the US, that's dominated the world scene in some ways since 1898, the Spanish-American War, but certainly since 1947, trying to deal with the next rising power that foresees its turn now to set the rules. But what's really fascinating to me is China really needs a type of status quo. They need to be in this discussion. So why do I actually think there's going to be a successful deal? And this is pure Ferguson speculating based on very little. I think it's actually in both China's interest and the US interest to hit a deal in which China gives us just a little bit to allow the system to keep moving.
But Susan, maybe that's and we have to wrap up because we're moving into the red already, I see here. But maybe isn't that kind of the challenge that both China and the US are figuring out their new role in this global economy?
And I think there are a lot of misperceptions here, and we haven't gotten into the misperceptions as much as we could or we would if we had more time. But we forget that with all of the trade back and forth and with the massive trade deficit, there's still well over $100 billion worth of U.S. exports to China every year.
Absolutely.
Including a lot of industrial goods.
Right. That
we do manufacture a whole lot in the United States, and that manufacturing output continues to go up and up and up in the United States, and that it's manufacturing employment that's been going down, a lot of which has to do with automation, most of which has to do with automation, but some of which has to do with imports.
Right.
And yes, to your point, there has been a marked drop-off in the enthusiasm on the part of corporate executives about the Chinese market, but that is not, it's not uniform. There are major, not just agricultural, but also industrial interests in the United States with a stake in the Chinese market. And for those of us who've been in the trade policy arena for a very long time, the Chinese market is far more open than the Japanese market ever was at this stage of development. Again, something that's not widely recognized. So going back to Roger's point, and we haven't even talked about value chains and the implications of that for the deficit, the actual deficit number as opposed to the nominal deficit number. There are plenty of reasons to figure out how to work out these differences and the very real problems. The challenge is both countries, and not just China and the United States, but here we're talking China and the United States, have very self-absorbed economic policies right now. And that's really the challenge. And both have domestic political imperatives that don't necessarily meet And
Yeah,
there
that's
there
really
you got
good.
the challenge.
I agree.
And underlying all that is your question about, is political economic dynamics not a much more important factor we need to look at rather than the smooth long-term estimates that we're looking at. And
versus
another time and another panel, we have to go more deeply into that. Roger and Susan, thanks very much. I thought it was a great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.